I'm Anna, and this is the R5 Leather Workshop. And today we're going to be making this cute little mini tote. So let's get started. The first thing we need to do is to create our pattern. Now in this case, unlike with the clutch, we're going to create our pattern onto a piece of poster board. This is a larger piece of scrap that I have that we're going to create the pattern onto. But I tend to buy poster board from like the Dollar Tree. At my Dollar Tree, the white poster board is 2 pieces for $1. So it's a really great resource to get inexpensive poster board and to create patterns that are pretty sturdy, and they will get dinged up over time. As you can see with this one of mine, it's got some dings on it and it's not in the best shape, but I've used it to make probably 30 bags. So it's a great resource for quick patterns. There are 2 different ways you can make the pattern. You can either make a pattern that encompasses the whole pattern itself, or create, when dealing with a tote bag, a half pattern. Basically 1/2 of the bag, which then you will copy twice onto the leather. I'll show you more specifics when we actually do the copying. For today's pattern, you're going to need a rectangle that is a rectangle of poster board that is 14 inches long by 21 inches high. You are then going to cut out the bottom portion of the bag at about 8 3/4 inches down and cut out a 2 inch by 4 inch rectangle. This would be the way to make a full pattern, but like I said, I personally prefer to do a half pattern, which I'm going to show you how I do that now. So a half pattern for this bag would be a 14 inch by 10 3/4 inch rectangle with a 2 inch square cut out from either of the corners. So as you may have noticed, I made a flimsy version of this pattern first. I like to do this a lot. This is just paper that was in a package that I got. I really like to just figure out my sizes, and this way I don't feel so wasteful reusing this paper to make kind of a tentative, and I can go, oh, do I like the size of this bag? So that's why it was there. So I've now translated that pattern onto poster board, and from here we're going to get started. The tools that you are going to need today include a hammer or awl, a ruler, wing dividers, a rotary blade or X-Acto knife, thread, blunted needles, scissors, a lighter, and die. Now that we've talked about the tools that you're going to need for this project, I want to talk about the leather that we're going to be using today. Today we're going to be using what remains of this piece of Horween Chromexcel. It's in their Dresner 8 color, which is sort of this reddish kind of brown. I can't really describe it. It's a really interesting color because when you put brown next to it, it looks brown, but if you put something more burgundy, it looks burgundy. It's a really, really unique color. So we're going to be using this today to make our tote bag. So as you can see here, I've got my leather laid out. I'm now going to take my pattern, and here's where I was talking about how I make a half pattern. So my pattern is here on the leather. I'm going to put my weights down so it doesn't move. And something you're going to want to do, especially if you're doing something like I am, where you're using kind of a smaller piece that remains, and if you want to maximize your leather, is to really nudge it up against edges, but also make sure that you have room for it, especially because you have to remember you're using this piece twice. So in this case, I have the leather pattern laid out on this leather. And then what I usually do, if I'm just trying to verify that my size is good, I'll lay an acrylic pattern down. This is the bottom edge. And when we draw this out, it'll get turned over. And I can see, yep, I have plenty of room. It's not going to go over the edge over here. It's not going to hit this piece that's been cut. Like, it's where I want it. It's not going to have any leather that's damaged in it, or potentially where there's a hole, things like that. So that's the first thing you need to do. So now that we're here, we're going to go ahead, lay it down. Now this cut here along this edge is not perfect, so I am going to give myself a little bit of an allowance there to make sure that everything will be straight. Again, I'm going to put my weights down. If you don't have weights, a lot of times I just use my awl as well as a way to hold the pattern down. So you're going to grab your scratch awl now and you're going to trace out the pattern. Now, you don't obviously want to scratch all this bottom edge because it actually isn't the end of the pattern. This is, again, a half of the pattern. So what I usually do is I make a little notch just right there so I know that it'll be lined up when I flip it. So then there's my little notch. And then I line up the pattern again. The other thing you can do is, because this should be a straight line here, is I will sometimes also straighten that out and make sure that this is straight as well. So I'm going to put my weights back down and then we scratch out the other side. So now you can see the full pattern. The other thing you could have done is you could have created this pattern as a whole to begin with, laid it down and traced it. Part of the reason I don't typically do that is it uses a lot of my poster board, and although poster board is cheap, I never know if I'm going to continue making the pattern. Also, from a storage perspective, it just seems way better to have a half pattern, so I just tend to always make half patterns. So from here, we're going to go ahead and cut out the pattern, or cut out the pattern that has now been scratched out onto the leather. So I do tend to put the acrylic ruler down, even though the lines have been drawn and you could just cut it. This just confirms that I get a straight edge, and also because you did take a half pattern and flip it, it also allows you to know that the pattern was straight on both sides, so that your pattern is has become a mirror image of itself to make the tote bag. So you're going to grab your rotary blade. Always check, if you haven't changed it in a while, it's always a good idea to put a new one in if needed. So how I typically cut patterns is I will cut the full rectangle out first. So now you have this rectangle shape, so we're going to cut out these little rectangles at the bottom there, or in the middle, I guess. It's the bottom of the bag, but it's in the middle of the pattern. And here is where I typically use my X-Acto knife, and I also grab this acrylic ruler that I have. I love this thing because it's 4 inches across, and I personally really like tote bags with a 4-inch bottom. For me, this works out great, but I do like to use this to cut out the bottom. And in this case, as you can see, I can just go 2 inches up on the pattern, and then here's my section. Now how I do this is I always start at the top, or I'm sorry, I always do the sides first and cut those. And you do need to be really careful here as to not go too far on either side. So what I tend to do is, again, I line this up and I'll start, and then I don't quite come to the end. And then I will just reline that up and get that notch there. And then sometimes you do need to go back and pull it out, but it's better to go back and do the minute details last so that you don't over slice your leather. Save these, they may come in handy later. So here is your bare bones tote bag. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to punch out where the straps are going to be. So for this, we're going to actually go back to our pattern piece. Something I like to do is I like to put in where the holes are going to be onto the pattern, and this way you can always make sure that if you make this bag again, it's uniform and everything works out. If you look at this one tote bag pattern that I've done a lot, like I said, it's well loved, but there are holes here and here for the handles of the tote bag, and then this here is actually for my logo. If you don't put a logo on yours, you obviously don't need to do that cutout, but I have one here in the middle specifically for knowing where the placement of my logo goes. So my standard for my spacing of my handles is about 6 inches apart. So what I do to line that up on my pattern is this piece is 14 inches across. So I find the halfway mark. So things are properly spaced. In this case, that would be 7 inches. And then I just go across 3 on either side of that. 1, 2, 3. I go across either side, 3, and then that's where my holes should be, at least as far as width apart this way. And then as far as how far you want down. So how I typically put the handles down is the first punch is typically a 1/2 inch from the top. So my first hole would go here, and then they're spaced 1 inch apart. Then from here I get my pound board actually, and I punch these holes into the pattern. And again, I do this so that then in the future when I make this bag again, I don't have to go through all these measurements every time. It's done. So this is where our our rivets are going to be for the pattern. And then also if you wanted to do a snap or something, you could also punch that hole at the dead center. We're not going to do a snap today, but you could do that and add that as well. Later on, hopefully we'll talk about how to install zippers and things like that. So now that we have where our handles are going to go, let's pull our pattern back out. So again, I'm going to lay the pattern on the bag, put my weights down. I'm going to grab my scratch awl and just mark at those holes where my holes will go. Oops, looks like I forgot to cut the bottom there. Do that here. So now that I've marked where my holes are going to go for my handles, we're just going to punch. We're going to punch those out. So now that you've got those holes punched, we're basically ready to assemble this bag. The first thing you want to do is assemble it inside out. So I've got my little clippy guys here. So I want to line up the top. Now these clips are only here to make sure everything is lined up. And now that that's lined up, I'm going to go through and clip these together. When I first started making tote bags, I actually glued these together. I stopped doing that, and now I clip everything. When dealing with anything I'm going to turn, because I realize that if you don't get your glue just right, you're gonna see it when you turn the bag, and you don't want that. And I've just decided to eliminate that problem completely and all together. So I no longer do that. I just clip everything. So this is the first step. You're going to clip everything together. Once you got those sides clipped, you can now punch your holes with the stitching chisels. Why do I have such a hard time saying that? So you may be wondering, how do I punch all this with the clips in place? It's really not that difficult. I'm gonna get out my wing dividers. Like I've stated before, I do tend to always keep mine at 1/4 inch, but if you have only a single pair like I do always check it to make sure I didn't change it for some other project. So yes, they're at 1/4 inch. And then I just score down the sides, going around my clips, moving them if I feel like I need to. And you'll do the same thing to the other side. And then how I work around these clips is typically just like you saw me do. I slide it. Oh, this one's broken. Okay. So I'll just slide it down. And I always, with my stitching chisels, I always remember to knock the first one on the outside, and then I tend to go in, down, and then you'll just continue down. So once you've punched your stitching holes all the way down on both sides, you're going to go ahead and stitch your leather together. And I know you're thinking, wait, what about the bottom? Well, we're going to do that next. So here, what we're going to do is now get out our thread and our needle. So as I've stated before, you're going to want to measure 4 lengths. I always do tend to do actually touch more than that. So there's 2 folded over and then a full length. And that's how much you would need. For a review on how to stitch this bag, check out this video on saddle stitching. Also, you can use an industrial sewing machine that can handle 1/4 width of leather. Now that your sides are stitched, whether you did them by hand or with a machine, you now need to deal with the bottoms. So typically what you need to do is you kind of fold them down to this kind of shape, and then I clip them. And mine don't always come out perfectly, but I always just kind of make sure. Man, those are breaking left and right today. It knows I'm filming, so they're breaking on me. So I just make that angle, and then I do the same over here as I try to get it as even as possible. Because of the way you cut them, they almost never come out perfect, but I always try to do the best I can. So there you can see it's inside out, obviously, but this is you starting to have that tote shape. So the next thing you're gonna need to do is get ready to punch holes in this. Now, even though I machine stitched across here, I actually am going to hand stitch this bottom section for 2 reasons. One, the bottom of a bag tends to take the brunt of the weight that you throw in it, and a saddle stitch is a slightly stronger stitch. I could just, double stitch everything on the machine if I wanted. The other problem is that because of this seam here, many times I find that my machine doesn't like this, and I'll break a needle or it jams. So it has turned out to just be easier to go ahead and hand stitch the bottoms typically. So now that I have clipped this, as you can see, this one is not quite even. I'll usually go back through and try to do the best I can to get these even. But like I said, you're never gonna cut perfectly. There's always gonna be little glitches, and luckily this gets turned. So now that we're here, I'm going to go ahead and punch the one side. Again, you could use glue here if you wanted. Again, it might be visible when you flip it, so I just don't do that anymore. I'm gonna use one of these heavier duty clips to pinch this side down so I can punch this. And yes, I am eyeballing this punch. And I want to make sure it went all the way through. Doesn't look like it quite did. All right, and then we're gonna punch the whole thing. Ugh, stupid clips. How many have I broken today? So now that we've got these holes punched, we're going to go ahead and pull out our thread. Like I said, I am going to hand stitch this. So just like before, it's 4 times the length. I do tend to overestimate mine. And you're going to get out your blunted needles. Okay, and then we're going to start stitching. So now that we've hand stitched the bottom here, you can see I went across the top here, and when dealing with this little section, I just stitch over it. It does end up with a little bit bigger stitch there, but that's the easiest way I found to do it. If you know of a different way, leave a comment down below. So now we get to the fun part, turning this. Now we get to the fun part, turning the bag. So you have your bag here, and now you have to turn it right side out. Now, if you've ever done any fabric work, it's much easier, I'm going to tell you, to do fabric than the tote bag. Also, the different types of leather you use will also make a difference. So usually I typically start by trying to get the corners done. So I tend to punch in the corners. This leather is pretty stiff. It's not thick per se, but it's stiff. I find the stiffest leathers are always the hardest. And it really just takes some energy. This is actually turning easier than I thought it would. So you can see I've started to turn this corner out, but now we have to do this corner. And my hand is just in a fist in here, and I'm not really doing anything except just stabilizing the bag as I try to push this other part. Now I'm grabbing it, and I'll tend to turn this. Once I get it to the point where I can use my hands and push on the inside, I'll tend to push more. I try not to pull from the inside when you have the leather, because if you have fingernails, or even if you don't have fingernails, you could scratch the leather. So I tend to kind of just, it's there to stabilize until I get it to kind of this point. And then I'm more willing to sort of pull things, because I can be more aware of where my fingernails are going. Now, these bags are really fun if you use what's called a pull-up leather. And a pull-up leather tends to create light colors where you've folded it and like mushed it. And they can be some of the most beautiful bags once you turn them. So some of my favorites that I've made have been with really rich pull-up leather. All right, let me get this finished and we'll put on the handles. Is our basic tote pattern, and this leather does have, no, it kind of has a pull up. You can see some lighter spots, but a true pull up leather has like just really contrasty look once you turn it. So now we got to get some straps. So now that the bag has been turned, you need to do your straps. So your strap length is really kind of your own personal preference. I tend to, in making a crossbody strap, make them about 60 to 55 to 60 inches with a buckle, which is something I will make a video about in the future. When doing a tote bag, I tend to make the straps 28 inches long so that it can be carried over your shoulder. But with this bag, because it's kind of this mini tote style, I'm actually going to lean to an even shorter one so you can just hold it like a handbag. So in this case, I think I'm going to go with a 14-inch strap. Now I have several pieces of strap here that I have pre-cut. You can either do this by cutting the straps with your rotary blade and just measuring out the width that you want. I tend to like a 3/4 inch strap. Inch straps are also very common. I did a lot of inch straps when I first started. They're easy to cut, easy to measure because it's an inch and you don't have to worry about that minute fraction with a 3/4 inch. I personally just like the aesthetic of a 3/4 inch. I think it looks a little more elegant, especially if you're not going to do any sort of fancy strap. So these have been pre-cut. You can also order pre-cut straps from most places, and you definitely want a thicker strap. I tend to use about 6-ounce leather for straps, and then if I don't have 6-ounce leather in the color I want, I will tend to put 2 pieces glued back to back and stitch them. Stitching straps takes a lot of time if you have to do it by hand, so I personally do like to just get a heavier strap. So this is 6-ounce leather that we're using here. This is also from Horween in a brown. Now that we have our straps cut, the first thing we need to do is trim off the corners. If you want yours just as a square shape, when you connect them, there's nothing wrong with that. I personally really like a curved edge, and I'm going to use this curved tool. This is a 3/4 inch. Oh, it doesn't want to focus. This is a 3/4 inch strap end tool. I really like these. I have one for an inch and one for a 3/4 inch. And you just line those up and trim off your edges, and it gives you a nice clean curved edge. If it will focus. There, it gives you a nice clean curved edge. So you're going to want to do that for all 4. And because the way I cut these, I always try to make sure that it's right on the edge so that your lengths don't get off. There. Okay, so now that we've cut our ends, this leather has not been struck through, so the die is only on the top, not on the back or through it. So we're going to go ahead and dye the sides. So I'm going to go through and do that. You could dye the back. I'm not going to here, mostly because this is a prototype in my mind, so it doesn't feel necessary to me personally, but you could dye the back and then, but I would tell you if you're gonna dye the back, make sure you let it dry and then do a layer of Toconol on the back. This will keep the dye from bleeding onto your clothing, and it will also seal it up. But for today's purposes, I am just going to dye back the edges. Also, I do this a lot with prototype bags. I don't want to call them shortcuts, but I don't always do all the little extras, partly because I just want to see if I like the shape of the bag or how it's going to be used. And then if I do sell them at one of the craft fairs I'm attending, I just sell it at a cheaper price because I didn't do all the extras. I didn't necessarily Toconol things or dye things all the way through. So, and then it allows someone to get a nice bag at a cheaper price. I'm also going to go ahead and dye the top of the bag as well. You could have done this actually before you even assembled the bag, but I just decided to do it now. So those are dyed. Now the last thing we have to do is punch the holes into these and put the rivets in. So as you saw before, my punches are an inch apart. So I tend to, same thing, I tend to go about a 1/2 inch in and mark at the halfway point. So in the case of a 3/4 inch strap, the center of the strap itself is going to be at 3/8 of an inch. Again, this is another reason why 1 inch straps are really helpful. You know you have to go a 1/2 inch in. The math isn't quite as funky, especially if you're not mathematically inclined. Always amazed how my math and fraction skills have come back. So you're going to mark these an inch down, and then you're going to punch the holes. And we're going to do that with all 4 sides, and then I will show you how to install the rivets. So now we've got all of our holes punched, and our holes are also punched on our bag here. So now we need to get out our rivets. I tend to use these double capped rivets. These are much easier to install than the brass or the copper ones you'll see a lot of people use. These are technically not as sturdy, but I have never personally had a problem as long as I use 2 rivets per side of the strap. Single rivets seem more likely to pop. It's not that I haven't had a rivet pop on me for bags, but they do tend to pop more if you don't have enough of them. So I always do 2 per side. So the last thing I kind of forgot to mention is you need what's called washers as well when using these. When installing your, it's down here. The other thing I kind of forgot to mention is you need what's called washers. This is focusing on that. You need washers to put on the back side of your bag. So I tend to use, I have this circular punch that I bought. Again, this is one of those tools I didn't really know I needed until I bought it. But so what I tend to do is I punch out. So in this case, we'll need 8 washers. So if you recall, these were the little pieces of scrap that I saved from the original cutting of the pattern. So don't throw out your scrap. There's always use for scrap. So from here, this is the best way I've found to make them at home. They do actually make a tool specifically that will punch a whole washer from like in one hammer throw, but I haven't invested in one of those yet. So I tend to use that circle one, and then I just use the little hole tool here to make washers. So now we have our washers. So now it's just kind of an assembly line thing. So from here, move this. So now we have our bag, we have our washers, and we have our rivets. So I'm going to take the strap, I'm going to take the rivet piece, I'm going to take one of the rivet pieces, go through, and I'm going to attach it at the bottom, and then take the back side. Oh, no, take a washer, put it on the inside, and then pinch it. Now this is not secured yet, as far as like the rivet hasn't been set, but it is connected, and as you can see, that's how it looks on the inside. So then once I have put them all in temporarily, then we'll go over to, I'll show you how to set these rivets. So now we have all of these rivets in. Now they haven't been set yet, so rivets like this will snap kind of into place, but they aren't strong yet. You have to actually set them. So one way to do this is with a tool. So we have this little flat guy that I used before, and you put this underneath. Where the rivet is, and you can hammer it in. Now, this obviously is awkward to do it this way. So if you have to do it with the hammer method, which here, you either have to, I'll do the top one here. You can fold it in and hammer. So this curved tool here, you just set on top. So you have the bottom rivet on the little metal guy there, and this hand piece, and then you just hammer it in. If you are restricted by this type and you don't yet have a hand press machine for this, I would recommend installing the straps prior to stitching everything together. I do have a hand press, and that I tend to do always at the end. So let me go finish installing these rivets and we'll finish this project up. So as you can see, now our tote bag is finished. It's got these cute little handles. There are other things you could add to this if you wanted. You could have added a snap so it snaps shut. You could also add a crossbody strap to it. But tote bags are really versatile this way in that this basic design and this assembly style can be adapted to multiple sizes and multiple types of bags. From this mini tote here to a large bag to even a simple crossbody bag, it really is a super versatile design. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and I can't wait to see you next time.